Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Alessandra Galloni. I'm Global Managing Editor at Reuters News Agency, and it is a pleasure, an extreme pleasure for me today to introduce Stacey Abrams, one of the Democratic Party's most prominent politicians, to speak with us today. Ms. Abrams is the former Democratic leader of the Georgia House of Representatives and the 2018 Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia, the first Black woman to become a gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the United States. And she's the founder of Fair Fight, an organization that promotes fairness in the electoral system, which is a topic that is clearly of great importance ahead of this year's US presidential elections on November 3rd. Ms. Abrams is also an accomplished author of a New York Times bestseller on leadership and of 8 romantic suspense novels. So, thank you for coming and joining us. I'd like to divide, I think we'll jump straight into questions, and we'll have a period of Q&A with me, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the virtual audience who will be emailing questions to me, and I'll moderate them. So I'd like to divide my questions into 3 areas. One, your general thoughts about the upcoming election and its importance now for the United States and for the United States' position in the world. 2, concerns over the well-functioning of the upcoming election. And 3, how the recent wave of racial reckoning in the United States, and not only, will play into the upcoming vote and into the politics of and policies of the new administration. So in general, you're one of the Democratic Party's most visible politicians. Your name has been included in lists of possible vice presidential candidates for presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden. And this year, possibly even more possibly than the 2016 vote, this election is being watched very, very closely around the world. Countries are waiting to define key policies on issues like climate, issues like trade, until they see who is in the White House. In your view, what are the biggest challenges that Joe Biden faces in this election, and how, in your view, can he overcome them?
I think the most startling challenge, unfortunately, in a democracy as robust and as stable as ours is the legitimacy of the election. Right now, we are watching the president and his administration take steps to undermine the election process, whether it's his newly appointed fundraiser turned postmaster general who has insisted on slowing the delivery of mail throughout the country, knowing that in the midst of a pandemic, it is going to be essential that millions of Americans vote by mail. And because of the patchwork of laws that exist in the United States, I described this in my new book, Our Time Is Now, we have a patchwork of laws so that rather than a central democracy, each state is responsible for administering the elections. That means you have 50 different sets of laws that determine who can vote by mail, how they can do so, the timing for the return of those ballots, and even who can receive those ballots. That lack of cohesion, unfortunately, undermines the ability of every American to have confidence that they can vote by mail and thus vote safely. But we also will still have to have people who can vote in person. And given the United States challenge with providing stimulus dollars to states that are cash strapped, their ability to both scale up mail-in voting, but also to remain a country that allows early voting and in-person voting on election day at the requisite number of polling places to make it accessible for Americans, that challenge also continues. And therefore, we need to see action by the US Senate to pass election security and election infrastructure financing, $3.6 billion, but we also need states to right-size their laws, and that's why it's important that the HEROES Act, which includes legislation that would create, for the purposes of this pandemic election, uniformity in our elections, that is really the gravest crisis that we face. Secondary to that, but important because of the long-term implications, is the completion of the 2020 census, which unfortunately the Trump administration is now artificially truncated. They've announced they intend to stop it a month early at a time when the communities of color that are most desperately in need of counting are actually behind in the count. And this will shave off an additional 30 days from their participation, which is a dangerous thing for the long-term health and safety of our country, because we will not know who we are and what we need.
So I want to come back to the HEROES Act and the census in a few minutes. But just to push you further on, if Democrats were to take the White House, other than the legitimacy question that you raised in the census, what, in your view, are the most important big picture policies for the new, if there is to be a new US government, beyond the two that you just mentioned?
COVID recovery is going to be the fulcrum around which most policies will be determined, but I think there's both domestic and international policy that will be a part of this conversation. We have to address the public health crisis that is the pandemic, and that means returning to a global health security system that unfortunately was dismantled by Donald Trump and built through the efforts of Vice President Biden during his tenure as Vice President for Barack Obama. And I think rebuilding that global health security system will include not only deploying better public health infrastructure in the United States, admitting that COVID-19 is not going to dissipate because of wishes, but that we are actually going to have to do the work of addressing a pandemic that is ravaging our country. But we also have to be participants in an international effort to deploy resources, deploy support, and deploy humanitarian global efforts, particularly anticipating when we have a vaccine. And so I think the United States, if it is run by Vice President Biden as the new president, that will be a central focus, because that public health crisis must be addressed to stabilize our international and national needs. There's the economic collapse that we are watching in the United States, and it's rippling around the world. We also have to have a president who's ready to address that economic recovery, and to do so in a way that builds back, not just what we had, but builds back better. And fortunately, Vice President Biden has a raft of policies that really anticipate what that looks like. But we again have to have this global lens on the fact that 100 million people are being forced back into poverty because of the economic crisis that we face. And the United States is going to have to be an active participant in how we stabilize a global economy and prepare for the next decade of growth. Third, we have the challenge that is making certain that the racial reckoning, and you referenced it earlier, that is an integral part of how COVID is playing out. In the United States, it's disproportionately harming African Americans and Latinos. And we know around the world that as COVID takes hold, the nations that have the least amount of support, that are the most economically vulnerable, are also facing racial consequences that are attendant to this disease. And so part of the responsibility is going to be that the United States has to demonstrate a competency at home so it can have a viability in helping address these challenges worldwide.
So as you say, the pandemic has upended the dynamics of race, and of the race. So how do you think that Biden and the Democratic Party can exploit this?
I think we're already watching the Democratic Party, led by Vice President Biden, addressing these challenges by acknowledging them. One of the deep disappointments of the current administration is their willful ignorance and their willingness to ignore the challenges that present themselves in real time. Right now, we have 1,000 Americans dying every minute, and yet the Trump administration refuses to acknowledge that reason, or that existence. We have a Senate run by Mitch McConnell that has convened, and actually they've gone home. He dismissed them without taking action on the COVID relief package that is absolutely necessary. 100 CEOs signed a letter demanding that action be taken to stabilize our economy. And unfortunately, there's no one in Washington ready to do the work on the Republican side. And so we know that, unfortunately, this isn't just an academic exercise. Americans are feeling the pain. They are watching unemployment skyrocket. 43 million Americans are now going to be subject to evictions. More than 30 million Americans face uncertainty about their employment. And we know that the unemployment rate is rising fastest in the most vulnerable and the least resilient communities in the United States. And so I believe that it's not about exploitation. It's about actually confronting the realities of what COVID has done to the United States, but understanding that the competency of our response is going to be one of the metrics by which we are judged in the international community, and we currently are failing that test.
The polls show that Democratic voters tend to be more worried about COVID. And so this means that they might be less likely to turn out to vote in person which obviously will make the functioning of the mail-in process even more crucial. Are you concerned about Democratic voter turnout in the election on November 3rd?
I'm concerned about the ability of Democrats and Americans writ large to participate in our elections. If you look at the breakdown of our politics, we are roughly a third to, a little more than a third Democratic, a little more than a third Republican, and then we have independents. And the reality is no election is won by one party or the other. It's won through coalition voting. And so our responsibility is to ensure that the machinery of democracy is working. Voting by mail is a critical piece of that because we've seen the consequences of not permitting vote by mail. What happened in Wisconsin when they shut down more than 180 polling places, leaving only 5 viable in Milwaukee, led to lines that led to people contracting COVID-19. That was in the first wave. We saw the absolute collapse of the electoral system in Georgia. We have seen across the country delays in counting ballots. And so what we have to do is recognize that the United States knows how to run elections. We just simply have to agree to do it properly. South Korea managed to run a nationwide election with one of the highest turnouts that they've seen since the 1990s, and the United States can do the same. But that means we have to pass the HEROES Act, which requires that every American who's eligible to vote be allowed to vote by mail, that we absolutely have extended in-person early voting, giving people time to vote before Election Day if they cannot vote by mail. And that really applies to our essential workers. And then that we have in-person voting where we do not decrease the number of polling places because there are people who do not have public transit or other ways to get to the polls. Particularly, we have to think about the disabled community, about those with language barriers, those who have been evicted and because they do or have been displaced or are homeless, who cannot vote by mail because they simply do not have a place to receive that mail. And we have to think about those who attempt to vote by mail but cannot accomplish it. Our bottom line is that we have to have a full toolbox of methods of voting. This works in other nations, it works in the United States, but we have to right size it and scale it up and fully fund it if we are going to have an effective election in November.
It seems that what you're describing really is you have two forces, right, that could thwart the ability of people to vote and then the subsequent counting of the votes. There's the classic voter suppression via voter registration, ballot access, the usual voter counting problems. And then you have the unique problem for this election, which is the disenfranchisement that could happen because of an overburdened system and the need to have more mail-in voting. But to your mind, which of these two worries you more? And if the election is marred, who suffers the most?
Well, I don't believe you can bifurcate it that easily. The reality is voter suppression, whether it is systemic, which is what we have faced for the last 20 years in the United States, or if it's episodic because of pandemic, if an eligible American is prevented from being able to cast their ballot and they want to do so, that is voter suppression and that is intolerable. Therefore, we are obliged to solve all of these problems. That's why Fair Fight has been doing the work, working with organizations around the country to shore up the ability of voters to register and stay on the rolls, to cast their ballots and to have their ballots counted. And that's the work we've been doing throughout these primaries. But it's also about making certain that the federal government take ownership of its obligation. The HEROES Act is designed to solve the problem of a crisis on a pandemic scale. The United States is a federalist system. We allow states to operate independently, but we rely on the federal government to step in to solve a crisis that no one state can solve alone. And when the abdication of responsibility that we've seen happen from the Republican-led Senate occurs, then we are watching on a national level this voter suppression that we unfortunately have been aware of at a state level for the last 20 years.
Which states are most at risk for these problems?
Well, Fair Fight has identified 18 states where voter suppression can actually sway the outcome of the election. Let me be clear. I believe voter suppression anywhere is a threat to our democracy, and I believe it is absolutely intolerable. But when you think about the deployment of resources in a presidential election, a U.S. Senate election, we have focused on the 18 states where the marginal difference can truly swing the election. So we're operating in the states where the electoral votes will change the outcome of the presidential election, where participation can change the outcome of the U.S. Senate election, but also down ballot races, because in a year where the U.S. Census is performed, and it only happens every 20 years at the same time as the presidential election, you're also electing the state legislators who will draw the political maps for the next decade. And so we cannot elide how important it is to not only elect a president who cares about democratic values, we have to elect state legislators who are fairly going to draw maps that do not unfairly poison or position communities against one another, but actually allow representative democracy to flourish in our states.
So we can come back to the census and redistricting, but your state, Georgia, which is a state that has long had a history of voter suppression and is an election battleground, has had huge problems during its primary. What has been done since then to improve the Georgia voting experience? And what do you think will happen specifically in Georgia in November?
First, we unfortunately saw in real time the concerns that we raised in 2018 that were dismissed by so many. They saw in real time on June 9th the voter suppression operating just as it had in 2018. We saw the collapse of machinery, the lack of resources, the inability of administrators to actually do their jobs because of the failed leadership of a Secretary of State who has abdicated his responsibility and shown a deliberate indifference to the voters of Georgia. Since that time, we, for the first time, have seen Republicans actually acknowledge that this is a challenge. The Speaker of the House convened his own set of investigations. We have seen counties really step up and demand more support and resources. We have heard from the Secretary of State that he intends to finally acknowledge his obligation to do his job for every county, but we have not yet seen it come to fruition. We do know that he unfortunately has refused to send out absentee ballot applications, in part because Democrats in the state of Georgia outperformed Republicans in their participation. Sadly, the participation of Georgians in the election have led to an attempt to constrain who can participate. But as a counterweight, we are working with national organizations who are helping voters get access to absentee ballots, getting those ballots turned in. We are going to have a runoff in August, and that will be another opportunity to see what is going to happen in November. But let's remember that Fair Fight Action has a lawsuit pending against the state, and we're one of many organizations that are suing the state to be better. I believe we will have a more fair election. I do not believe we will have mitigated every incident of voter suppression, but we are getting closer, and that's important because Georgia is a battleground state. We've got 16 electoral votes, 2 Senate seats that are open. We are unique in the United States with 2 open Senate seats. We have 2 competitive House seats, and we have an opportunity to flip the state chamber to Democrats in the House. That combination means that Georgia is a battleground state that can help set the direction of our country for the next decade. And my hope is that we will have a fair election that allows this to come to fruition.
So you raised your the legal action that Fair Fight introduced after the 2018 vote, and for those who don't remember, in 2018, you and your supporters said that the Georgia governor's race essentially was stolen from you by election fraud because the Kemp who ended up winning was at the time Secretary of State overseeing the election process. So you have said it was as if you were a player, a judge, and referee all in one. And then you had you introduced legal action, which is still underway. So beyond the measures that you've spoken about in the HEROES Act, what legal action exists to in the case of such fraud? You know, what effective legal tools or otherwise can thwart election fraud?
So let's take a step back. I do not say that the election was stolen from me. The lawsuit that we filed actually would not, if it's successful, would not place me in the governor's mansion.
Right.
My argument is that it was stolen from Georgia voters, and that's the critical piece. I acknowledge the legitimacy of the numbers based on the laws that they exist. My issue is that the laws that they exist are incorrect and should be changed, that they are unconstitutional on their face. And that's an important distinction because when we focus on voter suppression as an issue for politicians, it's easy to dismiss it because it's a single contest. Someone is in a bad mood and you can turn away from the effects. My responsibility is to make certain we're focusing on the average voter, the person whose voice was silenced. That is unconscionable in a democracy, and that should not happen. And so I want to be very clear that Fair Fight Action will not restore me to some electoral positioning. It is simply designed to ensure that no matter who's running for office, that the voters get to decide who leads them. And the work that we are doing in Georgia is looking at the specifics of Georgia's challenges, namely a lack of resourcing for those county officials who are responsible for administering the elections, a lack of training, a series of laws that impede the ability of voters to get on the rolls, stay on the rolls, and have their votes counted. We have also participated in additional litigation that is being replicated around the country. Absentee ballot reform. Unfortunately, we have too many absentee ballots that are rejected, particularly for Latinos, Blacks, and young people. If you're Latino or Black, you're twice as likely to have your absentee ballot rejected. If you're young, it's 5 times more likely. And so around the country, we are seeing litigation that seeks to make certain that if you are an eligible voter, your absentee ballot gets counted and that the rules that are constraining that are reduced. But we also have to remember that there's a very distinct difference between fraud and suppression. Fraud is an intent by a voter to pretend to be more than one person or to somehow rig the system. Voter fraud is almost incalculably rare in the United States. The Heritage Foundation, which is the arbiter of how many conservative cases of fraud they can find, at best says 1,300 out of 625 million votes cast. And so fraud is not a challenge in the United States. And the two cases, or the two most recent points of evidence, New Jersey and North Carolina, those were election fraud actions, not ones done by voters, but done by people who are trying to rig the elections outside of a voter's intent. And so let's be very clear, voter fraud is not the issue. Voter suppression is the issue. And voter suppression exists across this country. And so we've seen men like Mark Elias, lawyers from the Lawyers Committee, from DEMOS, from the ACLU, from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Leadership Conference, groups around this country have been fighting to protect access to the right to vote. And unfortunately, we're running into groups that are led by the Republican National Committee and the Trump administration, who are in the Trump campaign, who are doing their best to actually limit who has access to the ballot. In a representative democracy, when you try to cut off citizens from being able to access their vote, you are constraining and in fact working against the intent of the Constitution. And so our mission is to simply make certain that if you are eligible to vote in the United States, you have access to the right to vote. Sadly, the Republicans do not share that value system, and we're fighting around the country to make our belief and our vision for an inclusive and expanded democracy real.
You've made it very clear, and I think it is important that you clarify the difference between voter suppression and voter fraud, which, as you say, is rare in the United States. But let's look forward to Election Day, because the truth is that the massive shift to mail-in voting could mean that we won't know the election outcome for days and weeks. And I think the United States has never faced this, certainly at the national level in a presidential election, and that could be potentially an explosive situation. It could end up in court, you could have street protests, you could have both. And in fact, Joe Biden has said that this is his greatest fear, his sort of nightmare scenario, that Trump will refuse to accept the result. And so this in a way is, we'll see, this is neither suppression if everything works well, it's neither fraud perhaps, or maybe it is, but it's a more hazy area. So how much does this concern you?
Well, what concerns me is that we have to have this conversation now. I've been in conversations with a lot of newsrooms and with reporters and organizations. We have to realize that we're not going to have a decision by 11 p.m., by the end of prime time. It's just not going to happen. And it's not going to happen for a number of reasons. First and foremost, as you pointed out, the sheer volume of people who will be voting by mail is going to preclude the ability to count those ballots and adjudicate the outcome of the election by 11 p.m. on election night. We know that in my election in 2018, it took 10 days to fully adjudicate the issues that were raised. We're heading into week 6 in New York. We know that across the country, with the scaling up of vote by mail, we are going to see delays, and because of the lack of uniformity in the rules for adjudicating an absentee ballot, we are going to see different response times. But if we have uniformity that is applied by the federal government that says for this election, because of this unprecedented challenge, we are going to say that these are the guardrails and these are the resources we're willing to deploy. We can constrain that time to be not 6 weeks, but perhaps it's a 10-day period, a 5-day period. But what states are going to need, cash-strapped states that are facing the economic collapse that's pervading our country, they're going to need the resources to hire more people, to build the machinery to count those ballots. They're going to need to determine whose ballot needs to be questioned and who needs to provide additional information. But we also can't ignore the fact that the president has put in place a postmaster general who is slowing down the essential delivery of mail. And in a number of states where you have to have your ballot delivered by election day, but you have no control over how fast the mail will move, we know that is going to lead to a number of legal challenges in those states to determine whether a ballot should be counted or not. And so my admonition is that we have to approach November 3rd with patience. We have to do everything we can to certify that the elections are fair and as free as possible. But we also have to have patience in determining the outcome. But for those who share my political value system and want to see Vice President Biden as the next president of the United States, we are going to have to overwhelm the polls with our participation, because one of the clearest signs of victory will be not just how long it takes, but how overwhelming the margin of victory is. And I believe that given the failed leadership, the cowardice, and the incompetence of the Trump administration, we do have a number of Americans who are willing to do their part to ensure that we can deliver an overwhelming victory for Vice President Biden.
Do you think that the HEROES Act is enough to do everything that you've set out that states are going to need help doing, which is a matter of infrastructure and money, frankly?
Absolutely, because it does three things. One, it provides $3.6 billion. And for states, that infusion of capital is critical. One of the challenges we saw here in Georgia was that Fulton County, because of COVID, was rapidly losing access to workers. They demanded, or actually they begged for 250 additional workers. Those workers weren't provided, but at the same time, the Secretary of State spent $400,000 on commercial, thanking himself and congratulating himself on the failed deployment of those machines. So we know resources matter. We also know that the guardrails matter, and that is setting uniformity for how ballots will be received and how they'll be processed. And three, as I said earlier, it's about making sure that every state has the full toolbox of voting. Voting by mail, extended in-person early voting, and vote by mail, in-person voting on election day without a reduction in polling places. The HEROES Act requires all of those pieces, and if all of those pieces are put in place, yes, we will have a viable election that I think certainly won't be free of voter suppression, but it will be one of the best elections we've had, because for the first time, we will have uniformity in how Americans, regardless of where they live, can participate in our elections.
Good. So the HEROES Act is what needs to be done. Now, at the same time, is the Biden campaign getting ready, getting a host of lawyers together, getting a group together for the possible legal action that could come, that you said, could be a possibility because of the slowing of times, or we don't know what might happen after November 3rd. What is the campaign putting together in terms of possible legal action?
So Fair Fight was launched in 2019 and scaled because what we wanted to be able to do is build voter protection infrastructure in the 18 critical states for the White House, for the US Senate, and down ballot races. But we were building it for whomever the presumptive nominee would be. And so we have been in conversations with the Biden campaign for the last few months, making certain, in fact, we've been in communication with them throughout the campaign, as we did for anyone who was interested. But we've been able to scale it up, but we're also in the process of transferring that information, and that both the data and the infrastructure that we've built, transferring it to the Biden campaign in conversation with the DNC and the Biden campaign.
So Fair Fight is no, go ahead.
So Fair Fight is our organization built this infrastructure, but if you recall, we built it inside state parties, working with other organizations to make certain that at the time we have a nominee, that nominee can take over this infrastructure and scale it appropriately. We are very pleased that the Biden campaign is focused on this. They are focused on making sure that in every state, we have the ability to fight back against voter suppression, because we can't simply wait for the outcome. And that's been one of the challenges of fighting voter suppression, that most of the efforts focused on the aftermath as opposed to doing the work ahead of time to mitigate the harm that voter suppression presents. And so I'm very pleased to know that the Biden campaign is doing both, and that we're working to prevent voter suppression on the front end and that we're prepared to respond on the back end.
What is your expectation for Black voter turnout and support for Biden?
I believe that the African American community is very, very much invested in having a leader who sees us. We have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19, both disproportionately with contracting the disease, with dying from the disease, but also in the economic collapse. We have seen that the economic collapse has hurt African Americans and Latinos most strongly, but African Americans most of all. And we know that there has been very little attention from the Trump administration in mitigating the harm. When the PPP program was issued, the first round, only 1% of African American applicants received any resourcing. And we know around the country that even now the resources coming forward from the federal government to support Black businesses have been woefully inadequate. And so from every angle, we know that we need a new president. We also know that in the moment of racial reckoning, the president of the United States has spent his time disparaging John Lewis, disparaging Black Lives Matter, turning this into a referenda on whether or not there are fine people on both sides, to quote him from Charlottesville. Whereas Vice President Biden has been in conversation, he's been in communion with communities, and he has done the work of actually issuing plans and talking about what comes next. And so I believe that you will see very strong, not only enthusiasm for Vice President Biden, but turnout and participation. And we know that in Georgia, we hit 33% of the voting population in the primary, the highest level we have seen. And that is coming after my record number of 1.2 million African Americans voting. We know that around the country, we are seeing continued growth in Black participation in elections. And I know that Vice President Biden will take not a single community for granted. And we're going to do the work to turn out the Black community because it is the most loyal part of the Democratic Party. I will also say for Georgia, we have the single highest Black percentage of voters of any battleground state. And as I've said before, we have the opportunity to secure flipping the Senate and to secure 16 electoral college votes.
So it's interesting because around the world, sometimes when you have protests, for social justice, racial reckoning, everything that has been happening, sometimes it sours the desire of protesters, especially young protesters, on government, on the prospect of government. It turns them against it entirely. But it seems like you really believe that sort of from the streets, you go then to the ballot, that people feel energized by this, that actually government can change something.
I think we've seen a few things happen in this moment. I recently wrote an op-ed for the New York Times where I acknowledged that, go vote sounds like a slogan and not a solution. But part of what has to happen, and I think it is happening, and we're watching it play out in places like Minneapolis and in Camden, New Jersey, and around the country, where we are seeing protesters understand that they can protest in the streets, but they also have to protest at the ballot box. We've seen participation, but more importantly, we've seen responses from leaders. The fact that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed Congress is a far cry from what happened in 1992 after the Rodney King decision. What has happened in Minneapolis, where they have taken immediate steps to respond. What happened in Louisville, although they have yet to fully determine and I think appropriately adjudicate what happened to Breonna Taylor's killers, the fact that the city council took immediate action. And so what we're seeing is not simply a call for action by government, but responses. And we also have, unfortunately, a caricature in the White House that is a daily reminder of how critical it is that we have a true leader in the White House. Joe Biden is a leader. He is a man of courage and of competence. And the direct comparison with the current inhabitant of the White House, even if people don't feel necessarily enthusiastic about the person that is Joe Biden, they are enthusiastic about the policies that are Joe Biden. And that's what I think is going to matter in November.
You sound, very optimistic about turnout. Some have said that the Black voter distrust of mail-in ballots and on top of pandemic worries are a concern. It sounds like you don't see this as a major issue.
Oh, no, I do. I absolutely do, which is why I'm so insistent on the need for the HEROES Act. But I will also point out that for Black communities, for Latino communities, the distrust of mail-in voting is legitimate. You are twice as likely to have your ballot rejected. And so there's always been sort of a belt and suspenders requirement for Black voters, that we cannot simply rely on one method of voting. We have to have all of the options available, because voter suppression is real and it will mitigate our effectiveness. But we at the same time have to be very clear that voter depression is as much a challenge as voter suppression. And so I'm not being sanguine about this. I know that we have young Black voters who are desperately worried about their future, who need to hear about what plans exist for them. The work that I do, not only through Fair Fight, but through the work I do for Fair Count and my third organization, the Southern Economic Advancement Project, focuses on how we have legitimate conversations that acknowledge the angst and the anger and the anguish, but also connect the dots. And so, no, I don't believe that there is anyone who should take for granted a victory or even participation, but I believe the pathway to determine and to deliver that exists. And my responsibility, as I would say the responsibility of the Biden campaign and all who support him, is that we have to do our work to engage those communities, to acknowledge their legitimate concerns. But we begin with, I think, a group that is prone to listen, because the consequences of not participating are so stark and have been played out in real time over the last 4 years.
I have a couple other questions, and then there are a lot of questions coming in from the audience. So let's fast forward and, to January. You have a Biden administration in the White House. What are the first things that this new administration would need to do in terms of issues of racial reckoning, racial injustice, civil rights, police departments? What are the top three things?
Of course, it's going to be up to Vice President Biden to determine what his administration is going to focus on. I will tell you how I think you can construct this. The first obligation is to stabilize our democracy. Every policy that we seek flows from our ability to participate in our process. My investment in voting rights is not because the act of voting itself is so special. The act of voting is the power you have as a citizen to determine and to declare the policies you need to see. And so I would pass a version of H.R. 1 and restore the Voting Rights Act, as well as ensure that D.C. becomes a state, that Puerto Rico and the other territories have self-determination, and that we actually create an inclusive democracy in our country that permits automatic registration, same-day registration, universal access to vote by mail, and that actually regularizes and stabilizes how our democracy works, so that no matter where you live in our country, there is a floor below which your democratic access cannot fall. And that will be a first for the United States, because since our inception, voter suppression has been baked into the nature of who we are. The second thing would be, once you've stabilized democracy, the second thing is that you use that new democratic engagement to start to pass policies that cannot be undone by subsequent administrations. That's why it's going to be so critical to address the needs of our court system, to address the politics and the policies that flow from there. We are going to have to stabilize our economy and rebuild our public health infrastructure, because as dangerous and as devastating as COVID-19 has been, we know that COVID-21 may be out there, COVID-22. And so the next responsibility is going to be to use these new democratic powers to ensure that across the country, we are rebuilding our public health infrastructure, which also rebuilds the economies for many communities. Having public health infrastructure in place attracts jobs. It allows workers to to participate in the economy. And then it's the economic recovery. I've been very privileged to speak on behalf of Vice President Biden in Michigan and in Florida about his Build Back Better plan. Those plans are the right plans for not simply stabilizing our economy, but thinking about what the next economy needs to look like. And that means addressing access to capital for businesses, addressing the challenges of housing, because housing is a critical piece to building wealth, and addressing climate change, thinking about it not only as protecting the health of our communities, but also as an opportunity for clean energy jobs. Those are the pieces that really have to be at top of mind. And then the third is the work of international engagement. We have to restore our place in the international order, something that has been fractured by our pulling out of the Paris Agreement, by our pulling out of JCPOA, by our remarkable inattention to economies that are suffering and that need our participation. And we can use COVID recovery as a point of re-entry and reintroduction of American values around the world.
So in your book, How to Lead from the Outside, you talk about the key ingredients to leadership. So will we see you in national office as the vice presidential candidate?
I defer all questions about the VP vetting process to the Biden campaign.
But have you been interviewed?
I defer all questions about vice presidential vetting to the Biden campaign.
Okay, I'll leave aside vice president. What about attorney general?
I will leave all questions about whatever is going to happen with the Biden campaign to the Biden campaign. I mean, let's be clear.
Okay.
I've been very candid about my answers for 18 months. They have never varied. If asked, I'd be honored to serve. And if I'm qualified, yes, I am. But this is a job that can only be determined by the person who's making the selection, and that is Vice President Biden. I trust that he's going to make the right choice for his campaign and the right choice for his administration. And my responsibility is to ensure that every voter in America who wants to cast a ballot can do so if they are eligible, and that we have the right conversations to engage communities, especially communities of color and young people who feel sometimes adrift from this process. My work has been around pulling them together, engaging them, and turning them out. And that's the work I look forward to doing now through November.
And just last question on this. I mean, even if it is not you, how important is it that Biden's running mate be Black, that Biden's running mate be a woman? How important is demographics in this?
I think diversity is always critical, and it demonstrates not only a range of thought and experiences that are important in leadership, but changing the face of what leadership looks like is a good. I leave it to Vice President Biden to determine what that profile looks like. I am very pleased that he is committed to selecting a woman. I certainly believe that a woman of color brings a dimension of change to our country that is an important metric to look at. But I do not believe that not choosing a Black woman or a woman of color is going to invalidate the process. I think it's always good for us to see diversity in action, and that commitment to diversity can be played out in many ways. And I look forward to hearing how Vice President Biden intends to not only win the election, but how he selects his cabinet and how he puts together the government that will lead our country forward.
Great. Now, while I get the questions prepared, I have one last for you, which is that your romantic suspense novels, in many of them, there were strong, passionate women in high-powered careers, but sometimes with complicated pasts. And some of the titles of your books have been Reckless, Deception, Hidden Sins, Secrets and Lies, Never Tell, among others. So what would be the title of this chapter of your career?
I separate myself from my heroines, but I mean, I think fair fight is actually the phrase that best encapsulates the work I've tried to do. While fair fight is the title of my organization focusing on voter protection, fairness is critical. And my mission is not to say that I am deserving of victory at all times. That's not true for anyone. And my responsibility isn't to have things given. My mission is to make certain, and this trajectory of my life, my mission has been to ensure that there's a fair fight, that race and gender and geography are not seen as impediments to my success, but that the work I do has the benefit of creating not only a fair fight for myself, but a fair fight for others who come from positions of disadvantage or more marginalization, so that they know that they can be full participants in our democracy, because that's what we should be.
Okay, so fair fight is the next title of the next suspense romance.
I might have to have a conversation with our organizational structure, but yes, that would be.
Okay, we have questions from the audience. So one question, again, I think people are very interested in this. What can we do to ensure that the counting of mail-in ballots will be done properly and efficiently? You've answered to a certain extent, saying a lot of that is already in the HEROES Act. Is there?
Yes. So volunteer to be a poll observer. Sign up to be a poll worker. We need people in position to actually be in the room, to be outside having conversations with voters. And the way to do that, there's a process in every single community. So volunteer to be a poll worker or a poll watcher. The the titles change based on the county or the state you live in, but it's generally the same job. And we have to remember that in addition to the lawsuits that are being promulgated by the Republicans, they're also planning to stand up an army of 50,000 poll watchers who will intend to intimidate voters, much as they did in the 1980s. And that means that they're not only going to challenge their votes, they're going to challenge their right to vote. And so we need people who are on the other side, encouraging participation, defending the rights of our democracy, and doing the work. And so you can go to fairfight2020.org for more information, but you can also look at your state's Secretary of State's website will usually give you information about how you can participate in elections in your community. So get off the sidelines and be in the process.
Another question. Why does it seem like the Democratic National Party ignores the South when the Sun Belt is the future of the party compared to the Midwest that is trending whiter and older?
It is a tendency of politics, regardless of party, to fight the last battle. And so we know that in the last election, the Midwest is largely seen as the reason for the Electoral College tipping in Trump's direction. But I agree with you. And that's why we've been doing the work we do, not only in Georgia, but Fair Fight is operating in South Carolina because there's a winnable Senate race. We're in North Carolina, where Roy Cooper won in 2016, even though Secretary Clinton did not. We are in Florida. We are in Georgia. We are in Alabama, where we can hold a Senate seat. We are in Texas. And so I believe in the Sun Belt. I will say that Arizona and North Carolina have remained on the list for the Democratic National Committee, and Georgia has been added. Texas is in the conversation. Florida is a perennial goal. And so I do believe the attention that we need is starting to focus, but we need more attention. And that is why I'm so bullish and such a proselytizer about the South. Because yes, the population of the Sun Belt is the future of America, but it's also winnable now. What we demonstrated in Georgia without national investment, without national infrastructure, I came within 1.4% of winning that election, despite running against the Secretary of State who was controlling the election. Imagine what happens when you have the full force of democratic politics, democratic investment, and the investment in communities that are often left out of the process. When that happens, we win elections. And we know we can win. We just have to believe that it's worth the investment. And I'm actually very proud of the Biden campaign because they have signaled they intend to play here. They have hires here. They are doing that work across the South and Southwest. And I think we are seeing a shift, but we have to make certain that that shift isn't one time, that becomes a consistent investment that helps us build the capacity of Democrats to win in the South every election, every time.
Another question. Aside from the very important COVID response policies, I feel, this is the person who's asking the question, I feel that Vice President Biden and his running mate will be spending much of their term repairing damage at all levels done by the current administration. My question is, if you were selected as VP candidate and won the election, how would you prepare for office between November's results and taking office in January?
I would continue to do what I have done. I've been very privileged to have an atypical resume. As a young Black woman in the South, there were not a lot of opportunities to build a traditional resume of those who run for higher office. And so I've had to curate my own. I've run nonprofits. I've run businesses. I've been a leader in state government. I have worked very closely with the federal government on a number of issues. I've become a bit of an autodidact on the issue of foreign policy, finding opportunities to do fellowships around the country, around the world, learning. But I've also had the chance to represent the state of Georgia abroad. And so I would continue that type of tutelage. But what's most important is not the titles on a resume. It's the skill sets that you've built. And I would put the skill sets that I've built up against anyone else, because what you want is competency. You want the ability to understand, to synthesize information, but most importantly, you need someone who is willing to follow the direction of the president. The role of the vice president is to be the lieutenant, to help take in information, deliver the edicts of the president, and to guide policy. And those are things I've been able to do on smaller scales, but there's not a person standing for this opportunity who has ever done this job before. And so I would say that, like anyone, I think this is an answer you would get from anyone who is interested in this role, that the most important thing you can do is simply to learn, to listen, and to be an active participant in planning what can happen next for our country, which is that, yes, we have to repair what has been broken, But as the vice president likes to say, we've got to build back better, doing so in a way that ensures that we do not leave vulnerable what we have seen happen. And I know I appreciate the reference to my first book, Lead from the Outside, but in our time is now, I spend a great deal of time talking about what's next. How do we build for a future? Because we are a vulnerable democracy. We cannot take for granted that the populist authoritarian tendencies that we've seen from Trump are simply going to go away if he is no longer in office. He has been suborned and supported by those who have believed in his approach. And that tin pot dictatorship is something that can happen in the United States. We have seen other steady democracies fall in recent years, and we cannot believe that the America we love is immune.
There's a request for a bit more detail on a rejection of mail-in ballots. It says, the person says, you've spoken about the rejection of mail-in ballots and the disproportionate impact on voters of color. Can you talk a bit more about why these ballots are rejected and what potential steps could be taken to mitigate this? You've obviously spoken about this already, but maybe more detail on the steps to mitigate.
So there are a number of issues with mail-in ballots. Number one, there is no uniformity to the applications from state to state. And so you can have a ballot that is confusing. And if you are a younger voter, you are more likely to be confused by what you have to do because it's probably a new experience for you. In some states, they will help you. If you make a mistake, they'll send it back to you and say, fix it. But in a number of states, they do not. They simply reject it out of hand. And if you have not participated in the mail-in process, you don't know that you can check, or you may not be able to get the information you need, and you simply end up having your vote not count. Number two, there are a number of states that have what are called signature mismatch laws, meaning you sign the back of your application or the back of your ballot, you send it in, and they match it to the last or to a signature they have for you. Well, the problem is that your signatures don't always match. I like to say my signature doesn't match from Kroger to CVS. It depends on the implement you're using, the time of day that you sign. And signatures are not, signature matching is junk science. It is not scientifically proven to be a way to secure ballots, but it is often used by volunteers who are checking to see if it looks the same. And the reality is that if you're a person of color in particular, our names may not look like the normative names that the volunteers expect. And they are more likely to reject names that have punctuation differences, that are unfamiliar names. And women, especially women who hyphenate their names, will have their ballots rejected. And again, because the rejection process doesn't always require that states come back to you and say, please prove that this is you, please correct whatever defect we have seen, then those ballots get rejected and they don't get corrected. The last challenge is the timing. If you live in an area that is rural, that is under-resourced, that is underserved, you may do everything that you're supposed to do to get it in the mail in time, but if it doesn't get delivered on time, then the states that require that your ballot be returned by election day, you are more likely to have that ballot rejected. And because communities of color, namely Latino and African American, are more likely to live in under-resourced neighborhoods, they are also then more likely to have their ballots rejected. The worst community, though, for that is the Native American community, where they tend to have the most irregular access to the postal service, but also are the least likely to have access to convenient polling places. And so we have to keep in mind that when we talk about Black and brown communities, that includes API community, it also includes the Native American community, and their disenfranchisement is one of the most grotesque of all.
I think there's tons of questions. Perhaps I can forward them on to you, but just one last question that I think we have time for. And it is, if the HEROES Act is vital to a fair election, yet there is no path to its passage in the Senate, is an unfair election inevitable? And I'll add to that, if the HEROES Act doesn't pass or is not enough, what specifically is the campaign doing? What specifically is those who hope to be next in government? What specifically are they doing legally, preparing legally or otherwise to fix things should it not be fair?
So I approach it in this way. I want what's best for America. The HEROES Act is what's best. But I am a Black woman from the South. I grew up believing that you strive for what's best, but you prepare for catastrophe. Fair fight was born of the belief that there would be a catastrophe. I did not expect it to be a pandemic, but we knew that things weren't going to work the way they should. And so we have been working across the country in those 18 states to shore up access to the right to vote. And so, yes, there may not be a HEROES Act that may slow things down, but we are part of a coalition of organizations, not simply just people who want to be in office, because, if I'm selected, wonderful. If I'm not, my responsibility and my mission stands. I'm committed to voter protection. I'm committed to it because I've been doing this work since I was 17. It's just been scaled in a very different way. And what that means is that we've been working with these states, with these state parties, but also with nonpartisan organizations who are hard at work. We have seen a number of lawsuits that have been filed to make it easier. The HEROES Act does everything in one fell swoop, but if we don't get that, we're going to continue to do the hard work of suing and winning, of building capacity. Because not only do we do litigation and legislation, we also do advocacy. And we've built a raft of more than 50,000 volunteers nationwide. These are volunteers who called into Wisconsin and made certain that Wisconsin voters knew their rights as there were daily changes in their right to vote. Down here in Georgia, we made more than 900,000 phone calls and text messages. And around the country, we are doing this work. But just this week, we know that in Nevada, they have passed a law that's going to make it easier for people to vote by mail. In Minnesota, there was a recent settlement that says that if your ballot is postmarked, it's going to count and you don't have to have a witness to sign your absentee ballot, which was an incredible requirement that was going to forestall participation in Minnesota elections. In Pennsylvania, we're seeing changes. Around the country, we are seeing changes that are happening, but they're piecemeal. And so we have to understand that we want the big solution that solves it for everyone, but we're not going to stop fighting for the piecemeal solutions. We can't guarantee that there will be absolute access for every person, but we will not leave a stone unturned to make it possible.
So HEROES Act is the best outcome, but you're also preparing for the catastrophe of it not happening, and therefore you need to do the grunt work on the ground as you have been doing thus far.
Absolutely.
Okay, and on that, it is the end of the hour on the dot. Perhaps I'll find, if you're curious, a way to get you other questions that all the viewers have sent. Thank you again. It's been super informative, super interesting to talk to you. And I hope that if you do become the nominee for the vice presidential candidate, that you will let us know first.
I'm going to tell my mom first, and my dad, but we'll hear
after.
Third,
fifth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been wonderful speaking with you, Alessandra.
Bye-bye.